I saw a police officer with a baton hit a man in his late 70s, early 80s, right across the head. I heard a crack when it happened, and the guy was out. I don't know if they killed him or what. So I was there as a journalist. That's my role. Among other things, I was covering it for the evening news on Pacifica radio station KPFK in Los Angeles. And I was working with a team of people. We'd have people on the street. There were many protests, particularly Gaza protests and Ukraine war protests in Chicago, particularly against the Democratic Convention. We'd have people with the protesters streaming his video and interviews, people in the studio that we had set up to discuss that, and then live streaming that out, in addition to recorded material that we sent to our various media outlets, for me to KPFK for the evening news. This year was different in a number of ways, including the fact that most people knew that by the time of the election, Joe Biden would not be the nominee, even though he had been pretty much the only person running in the primaries. That's how it was engineered. And Donald Trump was a runaway in the primaries in the Republican Party. Everyone knew he was going to be the chosen candidate at the very beginning because he's extremely popular among Republican voters. That has been contested by polls, except for the final poll, which demonstrated it rather resoundingly. When we were looking at the way that the conventions were being managed, one of the things that we were looking at was the way it was handling what was happening in the street, and particularly, again, in Chicago. The Republicans had very little street protests. There were some what we call hired, vans with electronic displays on them that drove around the convention center during the highest traffic parts before it, as people went in and as people went out. There were two of these vans or three, I wasn't sure, and very little else. There were no protests of any consequence, maybe 10 people, 5 people, nothing like what we saw in Chicago, where there were, thousands and thousands of protesters. The way that the Democrats handled it was pretty much to ignore it and to focus on their, the stage on the convention, where they had an interesting display of neocons and generals for the party that was supposed to be putting democracy on the ballot. Well, my point there was to cover it as a journalist. I didn't really get any surprises. I had thought maybe there would be a surprise replacement of Kamala Harris with Hillary Clinton. I don't know, maybe they couldn't engineer it or whatever. That didn't happen. And nothing about the Republicans surprised me. Trump came out of there with a bump, which everyone expected. And he went on to win, which most people didn't expect, but I did. I'm 70 years old. I remember vividly the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. I didn't attend it, but it was on television, pretty much unmediated, and there was tremendous violence, police violence. They beat the hell out of protesters. There's a very strong anti-war protest in 1968. It was brutally suppressed by Mayor Daley at the time, and there were repercussions throughout the legal system and the culture and the political system for years afterwards. I started going to the conventions as a journalist regularly in 2004. I was at the Republican convention in New York in particular, and the atmosphere even then was almost like watching a movie of a close-up look inside of, say, Nazi Germany. The police presence is overwhelming. The weaponry on the police is, of military grade. There are so many police and weapons on display. Corrals around the protesters, and massive protests in 2004 against the war in Iraq. And then in 2008, I went to both conventions. In Denver, before that, I saw a police officer with a baton hit a man in his late 70s, early 80s, right across the head. I heard a crack when it happened, and the guy was out. I don't know if they killed him or what. There was a brutality to the exchange between the police and the protesters then that was out of scale, inappropriate for the mood of the protesters, which was not threatening violence at all. The police presence was so overwhelming, I didn't see them get brutal that way, but they pepper sprayed just about everyone that they saw. You would have maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people corralled into a city block, like the intersection, and then the police would come in and they would just fire tear gas canisters and spray from different spraying devices into the people. I saw an instance, for example, outside of Sears in the state capitol, near the state capitol building in St. Paul, where a group of horseback police were firing from the front of the store into the parking lot. I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 of them along a line, tear gases into a crowd that was really standing there with signs. And it's gotten worse each time. In 2016, when Hillary Clinton and Trump were running, this was the most interesting one that I saw. Anyway, the situation at that time, Clinton had won, at least according to the Democratic National Committee, had won the primaries. So there were lots of voters that had voted for her for certain. That convention was held in Philadelphia. And Trump was, had just made his entry into the presidential race and won the primary elections also pretty handily. So they had a convention first for the Republicans in Cleveland, and the left, the groups that call themselves the left here in the United States, swore that they were going to go to the RNC, the Republican National Convention, and shut it down. This was a slogan that was carried around, and an interesting alliance between Hillary Clinton supporters and the left at that time. Now, when we got to Cleveland, I got a hotel room outside the perimeter, and we had credentials to go in 2016. I'm staying about a mile outside the perimeter, and I call a taxi. A taxi comes and takes us, talking with a cabbie and saying, "Hey, would show us the protests because we understand there are going to be these massive protests." And the cab driver says there are no protests, and there won't be any protests here. So I thought he was, referring to the police being, brutal and or otherwise well organized. And he said no. So Cleveland is one of the what they call Rust Belt cities here, where it was built on manufacturing and related industries that have long since gone. And so the people are in a state of despair and have been for decades. He said that the only person in the entire campaign this year and for the last 2 or 3 presidential elections that's offered to promise to bring these people's jobs back is Donald Trump. This guy had 2 PhDs, one in history and one in sociology, I think, or some related field, political science. He says, whether you believe him or not, no one else is even raising the question. No one else is even acknowledging that this is a problem that needs to be solved. He said they are not going to protest him. And then he drove me around the perimeter of Cleveland, and it's surrounded by these empty factories where the people that live in the city see every day the places that they used to work, pay their mortgage and for their housing, the kids' college tuition, and all of that. So that was interesting to see that Donald Trump, the fascist, had that response. This is how he was being characterized. Had that response from the people in Cleveland. And then when we got to Philadelphia, There were massive protests in the streets against the Democratic Party by people in, Philadelphians, black and brown particularly, and also people that had come from across the country to protest against the war making. If you were watching this on television, you would have seen that the Democratic Convention was a picture of party unity, peace, love, and kumbaya. And the Republican Party was a bunch of conniving people, each trying to force out Trump because nobody likes him and somebody else wants to be top dog with protests and everything. But it was exactly the opposite of what we saw. Democratic Convention in 2016, for example, every day, the Sanders delegates, who were almost half the delegates, would stand up and walk out. And you're in a basketball arena. So when, half the people walk out, 7,000 people or something, stand up and walk out, where we're sitting in the immediate area outside the internal arena, where the vendors and everyone would be, you see it. You see a mob come out and gather. And we'd interview them. Why are you doing this? And the reason was that they were being mistreated, that they felt that the election was stolen from Bernie Sanders, that the issues that they had been drawn into be active in the party over were being completely ignored, and that they didn't want to have any part of it. None of this came across in the media. So looking at this, mediated only, by the media without actually being there, which is how almost everybody sees it, not just, on the other side of the world, but right here in the United States, you would have an entirely different picture of what's happening than what was actually happening.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，活肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。